The night was cold, unusually cold for early autumn, and as the wind whipped through the trees, Edward felt a sense of unease creeping up his spine. He walked up the familiar path leading to his home, the house where he had spent years building memories, a sanctuary from the demands of the outside world. The light from the street lamp flickered above him, casting long shadows on the pavement. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, yet something about the air felt off. It wasn't just the cold. It was a feeling that gnawed at him, a sensation that something had changed while he was gone. Edward had just returned from a business trip, his mind still preoccupied with the meeting he had attended, the dullness of the hotel room, and the long hours on the road. He had been gone for only 2 days, but it felt longer, as if the world had shifted in his absence. He pulled the keys from his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing the cool metal. There was one key in particular that he reached for, the key to his house. He had used it countless times before without a second thought, but tonight, as he approached the front door, something felt wrong. He inserted the key into the lock, turning it with a practiced motion. The metal clicked as it usually did, but then the lock didn't budge. He tried again, twisting the key harder, but the door remained firmly shut. His breath fogged in the air as he stood there, staring at the lock in confusion. It was a small thing, a minor inconvenience, but it struck him as odd. He had never had an issue with this lock before. Perhaps it was just the cold, he thought. Maybe the lock was stiff from the weather, or maybe the key had worn down over time. But as he tried again, a strange thought crossed his mind. Could someone have changed the lock while he was gone? The idea was absurd, but it lingered in his thoughts. He stepped back, inspecting the door as though it might reveal some hidden truth. The door was old, its wood creaking with age, but it had always been sturdy. There was no sign of damage or tampering. The key should have worked. He tried again, the frustration building with each failed attempt. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, the cold seeping through his coat. But still, the door remained locked. Panic fluttered in his chest. He stepped back, looking around the street, half expecting someone to be watching him, waiting for him to figure it out. The street was empty. No one was around, just the wind, the shadows, and the eerie quiet of the night. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for him inside the house. But what? Edward took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he tried the key one last time. The lock resisted, but then, just as he was about to give up, the key turned. The door creaked open. Relief washed over him, and he stepped inside, eager to escape the chill that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air inside felt different. It wasn't just the warmth of the house, it was something else, something subtle but unsettling. The house was quiet, too quiet. No creaks of the floorboards, no hum of the refrigerator, no sound of the wind outside. It felt as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Edward paused in the foyer, his eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. Everything appeared as it should be. The same old furniture, the same photographs on the walls. Yet a strange heaviness hung in the air, something that made him uneasy, as if the very walls were watching him. He shook off the feeling, telling himself it was just the long journey playing tricks on his mind. He moved further into the house, reaching for the light switch, but the room stayed dark. He tried again, but nothing happened. The electricity was out. That would explain the darkness, he thought, but it didn't ease the knot in his stomach. He made his way down the hallway, his footsteps muffled against the carpet. The house was silent. Too silent. It was as if it had been abandoned, but he knew it hadn't. As he approached the living room, a strange noise reached his ears, soft, almost imperceptible, like the faint rustling of fabric. He paused, holding his breath. There it was again. A rustle, followed by the sound of something shifting on the couch. Edward's heart skipped a beat. Who was here? He hadn't heard anyone come in, and yet the noise seemed so real, so present. He stepped cautiously into the room, his eyes darting around, looking for any sign of movement. At first, he saw nothing. The room was empty, but then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something, or rather, someone, sitting on the couch. His breath caught in his throat. There, on the couch, was a figure, hunched over slightly as if waiting. It was him. It looked exactly like him, sitting in the dim light, motionless. His heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the figure. It was wearing his clothes, his jacket, his shoes. The face was the same, pale, drawn, with the same dark eyes that stared back at him. The hair was even the same, tousled in the same way he always wore it. But it wasn't him. It couldn't be. Edward's first instinct was to run, to flee, but his legs felt rooted to the floor, as though the very air had thickened, making it impossible to move. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. Could it be some sort of trick, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But no, this thing, this person, was real. It was sitting there, perfectly still, and watching him. The room felt colder now, and Edward's breath came in shallow gasps. He glanced around, desperate to find an explanation, a reason for what he was seeing. The furniture was in its usual place, the room exactly as he had left it, except for the figure on the couch. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his hands clammy with sweat. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes never leaving the figure. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble, struggling to make sense of the impossible. Could someone have broken into his house and somehow copied him? It didn't make sense, but what else could it be? He reached the couch, his fingers trembling as he reached out to touch the arm of the figure. But just as his fingers brushed the fabric, the figure turned its head slowly, a slow, deliberate motion, and looked directly at him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The figure's eyes, his eyes, were empty, hollow, devoid of life. But then something shifted, something subtle, yet terrifying. A smile spread across the figure's face, a slow, unsettling grin that stretched too wide, too unnatural. It wasn't just a smile. It was a leer, an expression that made Edward's blood run cold. The figure's lips parted, revealing teeth that seemed just a little too sharp, just a little too white. It leaned forward slightly, and Edward could hear its breath, slow, measured, as though savoring the moment. His heart pounded in his chest, a heavy thud that filled his ears. And then the figure did something that made his stomach drop. It stood up. Edward stumbled backward, his hands instinctively reaching for the door, but there was no way out. The figure moved toward him with unnerving calm, its eyes never leaving his. He could feel the weight of its gaze, a suffocating presence that seemed to fill the entire room. Every step the figure took was deliberate, calculated, as though it knew exactly how to terrify him. When it was just inches away, The figure raised a hand, its fingers long and cold, and pressed a key into Edward's palm, his own house key, the one he had used to enter the house. A chill ran down his spine as he looked at the key, the metal gleaming in the dim light. The figure's smile never wavered as it reached for the door, its fingers brushing the handle. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it locked the door from the inside. Edward's breath caught in his throat as the sound of the lock clicking into place echoed through the room. The door was locked, and he was trapped. The figure turned back to him, its grin widening impossibly, and Edward understood then. The thing standing before him wasn't just a copy of him. It wasn't a trick of the mind. It had been waiting for him, watching him, and now it had him. There was no escape. As Edward stood there, frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, he felt a creeping sense of dread wash over him, sinking deeper into his bones with each passing second. His heart hammered in his chest, the steady thump of panic growing louder in his ears. The figure, his exact likeness, stood before him, a grotesque mockery of his own existence. It was as if a mirror had come to life, staring at him with a twisted grin. The very air in the room felt heavier now, thick with the tension of the impossible reality he found himself trapped in. He glanced desperately around the room as though searching for a way out, but there was none. The walls seemed to close in on him. His mind raced, trying to process the situation. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. He had to be imagining things, right? Some trick of the light, or maybe exhaustion from the trip, had finally caught up with him. He tried to convince himself, to rationalize the absurdity of it all, but the figure standing before him wasn't a hallucination. It was real. The eyes, dark and hollow, gleamed with a chilling awareness, a look that conveyed something far darker than mere imitation. This thing that looked like him, was fully aware of him, and it was smiling at him. Edward's throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, his mouth dry as dust. His feet were frozen to the floor as if his body had forgotten how to move. He wanted to run. He needed to run. But where could he go? The door was locked. There was no way out. He reached for his phone in his pocket, fingers fumbling in a desperate search for some sort of lifeline. But his phone was gone. He hadn't noticed it until now, but his jacket pocket felt empty. Panic surged in his chest, and his fingers flew to his other pockets, checking them frantically, but there was no sign of his phone. It was as if everything had been taken from him, leaving him powerless. "Who are you?" Edward's voice came out in a rasp, barely more than a whisper. He wasn't even sure if the words were meant for the figure or just an attempt to ground himself in reality. But the thing before him didn't answer. It simply continued to smile, a sickening wide grin that stretched too far, too unnaturally. Edward's thoughts swirled in a frantic frenzy. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but every theory seemed more impossible than the last. Had someone somehow broken into his house and tricked him into thinking they were him? The thought made no sense. Why would someone do that? And why was this figure so exactly like him, down to every detail? The way it stood, the way it moved, the way it looked, it was a perfect replica, but with something deeply wrong about it. Something that made his skin crawl. The figure raised a hand, long fingers stretched out, and Edward instinctively took a step back. The figure's hand moved toward him, its fingers cold and unnervingly steady. The room seemed to grow colder still, the temperature dropping as though some unseen force had entered, chilling the very air around them. Edward could see his breath now, the faint mist curling from his lips, and his pulse quickened. The figure's fingers brushed his cheek lightly, sending a shiver of ice down his spine. Edward flinched at the touch. The sensation of himself standing so close to him, touching him, was unbearable. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body refused to cooperate. It felt as though the figure was draining the very will to resist from him, numbing him, rendering him powerless. The figure's eyes were still locked on his, and that smile only grew wider. "Stop," Edward muttered, his voice hoarse. He didn't know if he was speaking to the figure or if he was speaking to himself, trying to keep the panic at bay. But it didn't stop. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering him, before taking a slow, deliberate step forward. Edward's legs were stiff, his body refusing to move as the space between them closed. "This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real." The mantra echoed in his head, but his reality was shifting around him, distorting with every passing second. The figure reached up and pulled at the collar of Edward's jacket, just as Edward had done so many times before. The familiar motion only made the situation more surreal, more terrifying. The figure's fingers brushed against Edward's neck, sending a fresh wave of panic through him. Suddenly, the figure's face grew closer, its lips moving to a fraction of an inch from his ear. Edward could feel its cold breath, could hear its steady, rhythmic exhale, but there was no sound, nothing but the thudding of his heart pounding in his chest. Then the figure straightened, releasing Edward's jacket and stepping back slightly, as though satisfied with its examination. Without warning, the figure turned, its back now facing Edward as it casually moved across the room. Edward's eyes followed it, unsure of what it was doing or what it intended. The figure moved with unnerving calmness, gliding across the floor with a deliberate grace that made Edward's skin prickle. It reached for the window, its fingers gently tapping against the glass, as though testing the temperature of the room or the world outside. For a moment, there was no sound but the creak of the window as the figure pulled it open. A cold gust of wind rushed in, sending the curtains fluttering. Edward's heart stopped as the figure paused, gazing out of the window into the darkness. Was it watching for something? Or was it simply taking in the night as if it belonged there, as if it belonged in his life, in his house? The thought made him dizzy. He had to escape. He had to get out of here. But the way the figure moved, the way it existed, it felt as though there were no escape, no chance of survival. He was trapped. The house, his home, had become a prison. The figure suddenly turned back to face him, its eyes gleaming in the dark, and Edward could see it clearly now. There was no doubt in his mind. This thing was not human. The smile, it was too wide, too unnatural. The eyes, they held something darker, something that sent a chill crawling down Edward's spine. It was as if the very essence of this being was not made of flesh and bone, but something far worse, something other. The figure's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, as though it were savoring its victory. Edward's breath came faster now, his chest tightening with terror. He couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. All he could do was stare at the thing that had taken his place in his own home. A low chuckle escaped from the figure's lips, and the sound made Edward's skin crawl. It was hollow, devoid of warmth. It wasn't a real laugh. It was a sound that echoed through his mind, rattling his sanity, eroding any sense of control he had left. It was mocking him. The figure was mocking him. And then, with deliberate slowness, the figure made its way back to the door. Edward's eyes widened, panic rising like a tidal wave. No, not again. The door was locked. He had tried to open it. He had been trapped in here, but as the figure approached the door, it did something that made Edward's stomach lurch. The figure turned the key in the lock, and the door clicked open as though it were nothing. The door stood ajar, and beyond it lay the world. But Edward couldn't move. His feet were planted to the floor, and the only thing that remained in his mind was the growing realization of what was happening. What had happened? The figure had locked him in, and now it was offering him the door to freedom, but there was no freedom. There was no escape. The world outside was as far from freedom as the grave. The figure stepped toward the door, its movement slow, as though savoring the moment. It glanced back at Edward one last time, its grin now wide and knowing. Edward tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to scream. He wanted to do something, anything. But it was too late. With a final glance, the figure stepped outside, leaving the door open behind it. And Edward was alone again, left to face the inevitable. Edward stood at the threshold of the open door, staring out into the night. The cool air swirled around him, biting at his skin as if the world outside had become a different realm altogether. The night was deep, stretching infinitely into darkness, the moon a pale, sickly orb hanging above. For a moment, there was nothing but the silence, eerily profound, like the calm before a storm. The door hung ajar, offering him a glimpse of the world beyond, but it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a trap, as though the very ground outside had transformed into something alien, something hostile. He took a hesitant step forward, but his feet felt heavy, weighted down by the invisible chains of fear and disbelief. Every instinct told him to flee, to run as far as he could from the nightmare he had just endured. But another part of him, the part that still clung to sanity, to logic, doubted the reality of it all. Was it real? Had he imagined the whole thing? It seemed impossible that what he had experienced was tangible. The figure, the copy, the thing that wore his face like a mask, none of it made sense. And yet, standing in the doorway of his own house, he could still feel the weight of its presence. The heavy, suffocating air still clung to him like a lingering shadow. The world outside was dark, but it felt familiar. The quiet of the street, the rustle of the leaves in the trees, the far-off hum of distant traffic, it all seemed unchanged, unaffected by the horrors that had unfolded in his home. But was it truly the same? Was he truly the same? Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. He didn't belong here anymore. He didn't belong anywhere. As he looked out into the distance, something stirred in the corner of his vision. A figure standing just beyond the porch light, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. For a moment, Edward thought his mind was playing tricks on him, that the terror had finally driven him mad. But no, the figure was real, and it was watching him. A chill ran through his body as he recognized the outline of the figure, the same tall frame, the same posture, the same presence. It was the copy, It had followed him outside, and now it stood there in the darkness, waiting. Its face was partially obscured, but Edward could feel the smile even without seeing it. He didn't need to see it. He knew it was there. Edward's breath hitched, and the instinct to run surged again, this time stronger than ever. He turned, ready to slam the door shut, to lock himself inside where it was safe, where the nightmare could be contained. But as he reached for the door, he stopped. There was a shift in the air, a subtle pressure that made him pause. The door wouldn't close. The door refused to close. It wasn't just stuck, like it had been before. It was as though something invisible was holding it open, preventing him from shutting it. His hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling, but he couldn't make himself move. His gaze flickered back to the figure standing in the shadows. The copy stepped forward, emerging from the dark like a predator on the prowl. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if savoring every moment of Edward's fear. It moved toward him with a confidence and ease that sent shivers down his spine. Edward wanted to scream, to shout, but no sound came out. His throat was tight, constricted, as though his own body was betraying him. He couldn't run, he couldn't escape. The figure reached the porch steps, its footsteps light as though it were walking on air. It stopped just at the edge of the light, where the shadows swallowed it whole. But its presence lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. For a long, agonizing moment, there was no sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence pressing in on all sides. And then, without warning, the figure stepped forward again, this time into the light. Edward's heart stopped. It was him. It was exactly him. But there was something different, something wrong. The figure's eyes were darker, deeper, and the smile, it was more pronounced, more twisted than before. It wasn't just a smile. It was an expression of satisfaction, of victory, as if it had been waiting for this moment, for Edward to realize the truth. The figure spoke then, but it wasn't a voice Edward recognized. It was hollow, echoing, distant, as though it came from somewhere far beyond this world. "You were never meant to leave," the voice said, its tone dripping with menace. The words hung in the air, heavier than the night itself. "You don't belong in this world anymore." Edward took a step back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The words sank into him, deep and cold, like stones in his chest. What did it mean? What was it trying to say? The figure stepped closer, its eyes never leaving Edward's face. There was a gleam of something terrible in those eyes, something dark and ancient, a power that Edward couldn't comprehend. He felt it in the very air around him, suffocating him, draining him. The copy had taken his place, yes, but that was only part of the truth. This thing, this entity, was something far beyond mere imitation. It was something born from the deepest parts of the human psyche, a manifestation of all the things Edward had ever feared, all the things he had ever tried to escape. And now it had taken root in his home, in his life. As the figure approached, Edward felt the world shift once again. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as though it were dissolving, melting away. The porch, the house, the very space around him seemed to warp, twisting into something unrecognizable. The darkness outside grew darker, deeper, and the night sky above seemed to collapse inward, swallowing everything in its path. Edward stumbled, disoriented, trying to grasp onto something, anything, to ground himself. But there was nothing to hold on to. nothing but the endless abyss that was closing in around him. The figure reached out, its hand a mere inch from Edward's face. He flinched, but there was nowhere to go. The air grew colder still, and the pressure in his chest intensified. He couldn't breathe. His mind spun in frantic circles, unable to process what was happening, what had already happened. The truth was settling in, slowly but undeniably. The figure wasn't just a copy. It wasn't just a part of him. It was the end of him. And then, just as Edward thought he might suffocate from the weight of it all, the figure spoke again. But this time, the words were different. They were softer, almost comforting. "It's over now," it said, the voice like a lullaby, a dark whisper in the night. "It's all over." Edward's vision blurred. The world spun around him. The figure's face was the last thing he saw before everything went dark. When Edward awoke, the house was still. The door was closed, locked tight. The world outside was just as it had always been, quiet, still unchanged. There was no figure, no shadow standing at the edge of the porch. The night was calm. It was peaceful. It was as though nothing had ever happened. But as Edward looked around the room, he saw the truth in the reflection of the glass. There, in the dim light of the hallway, stood another figure, another him. It was the same as the first, the same face, the same smile, the same eyes. It was watching him, and now Edward understood. The game had been played, and he had lost. He was no longer the one who belonged here. The copy, the other, was the one in control now. And as Edward's reflection stared back at him, he knew that he was the one who had been locked away, trapped in this world that had never truly been his. The door clicked shut behind him, and the figure smiled. And Edward at last understood that there was no escaping the thing that had always been inside him. It had always been waiting. And now it was free.